Hi guys, let's look at our graph number 23 today, the long run perfectly competitive markets. And as we know from long run perfectly competitive markets, we know that we will experience no economic profit. We have normal profit only. And this is a very typical looking graph. You don't need to have the numbers on the vertical or the horizontal axes. I just did that as a reference point for a previous graph, and I copied that data over again. So let's take a look at the first thing I would do whenever you do any of these graphs. You get the axes labels set up. You'll want to draw the marginal cost curve, and it's always going to be a curve that I say looks like a giant check mark or a Nike swoosh. Start with that. The second curve that you always try to draw, or that I always try to advise students to draw, is the average total cost curve. You see it here in red. Let me highlight this for you. It should intersect the marginal cost curve at the average total cost curve's lowest point. And I got a little shaky there, but that's fine. And then the average variable cost curve is important also to examine when you look at long-run perfectly competitive marketplaces, though not necessarily essential in this case, but it's valuable to put on because it's valuable in the short run, so it's good to see here again as well. It starts rather far away from the average total cost curve here, but it gets closer and closer to the average total cost curve, but never touches. The distance between those two curves, remember, is the average fixed cost at any one of the quantity levels. And just like the average total cost curve, it should intersect the marginal cost curve at the lowest point on the average variable cost curve. So there's the basic shape of those three curves. And then most importantly, for the long run perfectly competitive market, the marginal revenue and demand and average revenue and price curve is all the same at the same level. And in this case, it's perfectly horizontal. And you can see that as evident with the pink curve on the graph. This is the basic setup and shape of your long run perfectly competitive market graph. Couple of things that you want to note about efficiencies, which we'll talk about in a different lecture here. But this market is completely efficient in many different ways because of the way the graph is set up. The last thing we'll ought to note, I'm trying to get my students to identify more closely, is you want to see where the market is, or where this particular firm would be profit maximizing. And profit maximizing is where marginal revenue equals marginal costs, and that is right there on your graph. And you're going to see that this point on the graph, I'm going to change colors, this point on your graph becomes very important because this is your profit maximizing level, but it also becomes a level of efficiency that can't be matched by any other market structure that you'll see. It's not a perfect example of a graph, but this gets you the very, very basic shapes. So a couple of things to note, and I'm going to write them and then erase them so I don't run out of room, but so you can still see the graph. If we look at whether this firm in the perfectly competitive marketplace in the long run is efficient, it is allocatively efficient. I'm going to abbreviate efficient. Allocatively efficient. How do we know that? Allocative efficiency occurs where supply equals demand. Or in this case, the demand curve is our pink curve, and the supply curve is the same thing as our marginal cost. So allocative efficiency in this graph is going to be where the demand curve equals the marginal cost curve. So we can see that if we're operating at this profit maximizing level, roughly 3.6 if we're going to ballpark something, or 360 in hundreds, I'm sorry. If we're operating at that level, our firm is allocatively efficient. If we're looking for productive efficiency, or productively efficient, that's going to operate, or a firm that's productively efficient will operate where the average total cost is the lowest. And this is where my graph is a little faulty, but the average total cost curve should be at its lowest point where it crosses at the point at 360, the quantity 360. So long run, perfectly competitive markets are also allocatively or productively efficient. So we have profit maximization, allocative, and productive efficiency all at the same point. This is the only market structure that you will see that will have those all in common, and those are definitely important to consider when looking at efficiencies in a marketplace. Now, the other thing that you might consider is revenue maximization. It doesn't apply to this graph, but it's worthwhile to consider. That's when the marginal revenue is equal to 0. As you can see, we could go out to infinity, and that's not going to be the case in perfectly competitive markets because you can keep maximizing revenue, but it doesn't affect your overall profits in the long run. So please make a note of those items on your graph, and you'll see that come up again in our lecture momentarily.